Welcome to Are You Afraid of the Dork, Season 1, Episode 3. I'm your horrid host, Mr. Dork, and I'm back and brimming with more boisterousness than ever, and just as liable to make it your problem as you'd expect. Before we begin, as per usual, I'd like to issue an apology. Last week I must have clicked my tongue like 20 frickin' times during the reading. It was only half intentional, and to be clear, I would do it again if given the chance. But I just felt it pertinent to mention that some small part of me regrets it, and going forward, I will strive never overdo it with my tortured tongue again. As for the content warning, I'm not really feeling it this week. To be honest, this week's tale was given to me by some mud-covered rando in the dead of night the other day, so I've truthfully got no more idea what it says, or if it's even a story at all until we start reading here. So won't that be a fun little adventure for us? Anywho, I'm just opening it now. It appears to be called Almost Happily Ever After. And so, without further ado, that.
Almost happily ever after. Once upon a time, there lived a man who was known as Sir Hendwig the Merry, a knight of humble origin who a lot of exciting fantasy stuff happened to. He solved riddles for trolls that lived under bridges, and defended peasant villages from packs of rabid goblins and abusive landlords alike. He duelled with purple, black, and blue-armoured knights until his skin sported very similar colours for a time, and won over the hearts of many nobility through his superior jousting technique. He outmanoeuvred giants, outwitted warlocks, and just plain outed witches before they could so much as lift a magical finger against innocent, unsuspecting children within their vicinity. It was a grand old time to be a knight, and Sir Hendwig cherished every moment of it. But as it stood, Sir Hendwig was perhaps getting a little up there in years to be a knight, and subsequently required a nice retirement fund if he was to while away his remaining days in the usual merriment and drunkenness which had characterized much of his life so far. So it was that Sir Hendwig the Merry reviewed his accounts, only to find that he had a particularly significant unresolved quest on his books. It involved the promise to a neighbouring lord who reigned over a territory not 1,000 paces away from his humble village of origin. The standard fare so far. But, as he read on, his eyes and financial instincts alike perked up. For this noble, who, judging by the font he was using, was positively loaded, had a daughter who was adjacent to terrible peril, the very best sort to extort an exorbitant price, being guarded by a dread beast that only the boldest and most foolish in the land would dare to engage. Jumping for joy, Hendwig thanked his luck with this noble's most opportune of inconveniences, for the quest was a few years old, and if it had been any less a creature guarding the noble's daughter, then it would surely have been slain by now, and she would have been claimed. But that wasn't even the best part. The dread beast in question? Get this. It was a blue speckled dragon. To most lords and lay people, the most ferocious thing imaginable. But to Sir Hendwig, whose extended family were all working-class dragon hunters, why, it was not only a good sign of things to come, but once slain would no doubt serve to bolster his notoriety as a knight rather significantly. A blue speckled dragon. They'd give him his own castle yet. What a note to go out on. Why, with this under his belt, surely the bards would be singing his name for many a year to come. So, rather excited about the journey to come, Sir Hendwig wrote the noble of Middlesbrough, father of one most distressed and most affluent damsel. In his letter he spoke of his intentions to finally complete his quest and wed his daughter afterward, as was a customary reward doled out by fathers of damsels to knights who completed particularly great tasks in Hendwig's time. But ever vigilant of a potential for a cruel twist of fate, before sending his letter, Sir Hendwig first took it upon himself to ask those in her community about the particulars of this fair but presently most indisposed maiden, like whether she possessed all the traditional feminine graces, and whether she was of fair skin and modest temperament, or whether the elements had managed to take their toll, or whether it could be said she had a more naturally gaunt or motherly figure, and if more one than the other, and to what extent. and so it went for a brief time until Sir Hendrik had all of his questions answered to his satisfaction. And, finding them all to be most pleasing to him, he doubled down on his feelings of elation from before, and marvelled at his sheer good fortune at having so fine a prize lined up for him at such a natural climax of his life.
The maiden would be his. Her dowry would be paid in full in the form of this quest. Truly a feat worth consummating.
So it was that after receiving the blessing of a local priest, a sword from a local relative, and gathering of some local basic questing materials, Sir Hendrik at last departed, eager to collect a much-deserved bounty fate had laid before his feet some 2 years before. By now she must have been 19 years old. Perhaps a little old by the standards of an unmarried girl. She wasn't overly so, and besides, Sir Hendrik reckoned that it was unreasonable to expect anyone to be perfect. In truth, in classic medieval fashion, the only reason he had initially decided to seek her out after all this time had been to secure for himself a path to a bigger fortune and better standing within his community, and perhaps, if he played his cards right, a path to nobility for his heirs, wherever they all were now. But the more he mulled it over, and got a feel for the situation, the more Hendrik realized that he was perhaps beginning to love her. Truly, if she was half as ravishing and rich in all that mattered as had been described to him, then he and this noble's daughter could be assured a very happy life together yet. But the path ahead was long, and it remained far from easy, for the part of the country in which the maiden was being kept was poorly charted, and rife with dangers great and small, assuming his mapmaker had taken no artistic liberties. A lesser knight would have balked at the challenges this quest presented, and turned back for fear of succumbing to the evil monsters and men which opposed them around every bend. But Sir Hendrik was not just an extraordinary knight, but a great man, which naturally made him that much more confident, forging ahead with the utmost bravery and conviction to lay claim to all which were most deservedly his.
"I'll smash you into paste,"
proclaimed the giant. "Aha! Not if I mince you to pieces first," proclaimed Hendrik right back.
"Hee, we'll capture you and boil you alive,"
cackled the squad of goblins. "Aha! Not if you're allergic to swords," laughed Hendrik in response.
"The maiden has probably lost her figure after all this time being holed away. No doubt she possesses a form near indistinguishable in repulsiveness from the very dragon guarding her,"
whispered the anxious voice in Hendrik's head. "Not if she's as pure and good of heart as I already know her to be," whispered the more aggressive voice in Hendrik's head in response. These were but a small smattering of the challenges, both physical and mental, which conspired to undermine Sir Hendrik the Merry's faith in the fundamental goodness of his quest. But come what may, he persevered in his typical knightly way that had defined his career so far, and at last he had arrived. The Dragon's Keep.
It was an ugly beige building, with a coarse sandy texture and some of the worst landscaping he had ever seen.
The landscaping part he could forgive, as dragons lacked opposable thumbs and tended to eat the roaming packs of gardeners, which would occasionally bumble their way through the land, beautifying what they could. The tacky choice of building, however, was less forgivable, and honestly Hendrik's first real letdown of this particular quest. It didn't look cool, it didn't look intimidating, it just looked and felt lame. And the last thing Hendrik wanted to feel before dueling a blue speckled dragon, one of nature's most awe-inspiring and fun-to-kill creatures, was lame. Things soon took a turn for the wonderful again upon first catching sight of the maiden, some 7 stories high through a tower window. The stories were no joke. This girl was frickin' hot, or whatever the medieval equivalent was. From her pasty white skin to her amply proportioned child-rearing hips, to her untamed and curly orange locks of hair, to her generous frame, which spoke to her relative affluence, relative to most peasants, and general fitness for woman's 2 and only duties in life. She was truly a gorgeous specimen to behold, even from afar, and every bit as worthy of a knight of his caliber as Hendrik had hoped her to be. But daydreams, like most good things, must also come to an end, And so it was that as Hendrik approached the dragon's keep, the dread beast, the blue-speckled dragon, finally reared its majestic spiky head. The resulting clash lasted hours. There was some stabbing, some dodge rolls, some strafing, the works, but also some bone-chucking, object-melting, a castle chase, and even a brief dragon-riding sequence. Supposing you had been there, then you probably would have been very much on the fence regarding who was going to kill whom, right up until the end. And supposing sports commentators had existed back in Hendrik's day, then his fight with the dragon probably would have made like 3 of the top 10 sports clips of the week, at least in the region. Yeah, it was just that great of an encounter. Yet upon the dragon's eventual defeat, and after hearing its final bone-rattling cry, Hendrik's mind was surprisingly blank. Perhaps from hunger? Perhaps from exhaustion? Perhaps from a large combination of things? Wasn't super clear. It was an amazing accomplishment, to be certain, just not one which seemed to warrant all that much reflection after just going at it for several hours. At least, not in Hendrik's case. But for as tired as he was, one thing still pressed rather heavily on his mind. Even as he stumbled mindlessly up the stairs, swaying every so often from the sensation of his muscles having overextended themselves long past the point of weariness from the grueling fight before. She would finally be his. Higher and higher he climbed, slowly trotting up the spiral staircase in his battle-worn light armor, almost falling, but catching himself every time. Till at last he stood before it, the door to her room, a room belonging to a beautiful girl who would tend to him, delight in his company, rejuvenate his spirit, grant him support on his way back, and eventually marry him in recognition of his outstanding heroism. Truly a most excellent prize for a knight so exceptional as him. He wondered what her exercise routine was like, or whether she was any good at housework, or what she ate at all, for that matter, in light of... His mind was wandering. Hendrik figured that must have been the exhaustion again as he shook his head, silently chastising himself for his lack of focus when he was so close to the end of a quest. Opening her door and taking a step forward, the brave Sir Knight once more caught a glimpse of the maiden to which he had so wholeheartedly devoted the last few weeks of his life. Her eyes flew wide open upon catching sight of him, tears slightly welling in the corners, perhaps from joy, perhaps from something else, as she made a slight movement toward him. She looked incredible, whereas before he had been able to recognize her as merely beautiful, a relatively common state and temptation of the fairer sex. It was only now, with her live and in person, and no more than 10 paces in front of him, that Hendrik was finally beginning to appreciate just how incomparable a beauty she was. But before he could process all that much more, Hendrik tripped forward, held out his arms to correct himself, and accidentally overcompensated, resulting in him stumbling backward, through the open door frame, down the spiral stairwell, clanking and clashing, bouncing and smashing into walls and stairs of various textures and pronouncements, all the way down the tower, until at last his body flew to the ground in a crumpled heap on the first floor, his head somehow bashing into a very heavy wooden table which was near the base of the stairs, and violently splitting open, bits of self-hooded skull, blood and brain gushing everywhere. Such was the arguably anticlimactic end of Sir Hendrik the Merry. 3 weeks later, a follow-up party from Middlesbrough checked in to assess the latest challenge's progress, and proceeded to collect the noble's daughter without incident, prompting much cause for citywide joy and celebration. Curiously, from Hendrik's maiden-to-be most of all. And so it came to be that the only person who couldn't appreciate Hendrik's greatest accomplishment was himself. The end.
Wait, why am I laughing? Do you know? Does anyone know? Well, whatever. Story's over. Or at least I'm 95% sure that's what that was. And what do you know? It even had one of those spiffy, dark, and dorky endings I love so much. Without giving it too much thought, I guess the horror from this week's tale was primarily derived from the idea of not being able to get what you want out of life 100% of the time. Yes, how truly terrifying, how stupendously sinister. The notion that all of you, or God forbid, even me, might not achieve fulfillment in all things prior to croaking. It's truthfully quite an obvious notion, but I guess a worthwhile thing to be periodically reminded of, and to have made your peace with, nonetheless. Oh, and in case it wasn't clear, other people aren't just a means to your ends, so it's probably not the worst idea in the world to treat them as beings with their own thoughts, desires, and agency, independent of yourself, even if you could foresee them becoming a rather shiny trophy in your case, so to speak. I mean, you're not Medusa, nor a king named Midas, and besides, everyone knows, at least the vast majority, would be much happier being permitted to live as living, breathing beings than lifeless trinkets posed and positioned for your pleasure. So get a grip and have a little class. Blah, 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 blah. But anyway, this was your horrid host, he who chatters in the dark, reminding you that monsters are real, as well as signing off. As per usual, be seeing you in your nightmares, and just wanted to remind each and every one of you to remember between now and next week that at least one person cares about you. If not now, then at some point in your past. Oh, my throat.